Hello, and welcome to the 27th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts dozens of free and low-cost readings, craft classes, panel discussions, and many more exciting literary events. This year's headlining authors are Maggie Smith, Li-Young Lee, and Danez Smith. We're thrilled to be hosting in-person events featuring those headliners alongside over 60 talented writers from our region and beyond. The festival takes place this Thursday through Sunday, April 10th through the 13th, in many venues across downtown Spokane, Cheney, and even Coeur d'Alene. And we're excited to be presenting 8 virtual events here on YouTube this year. You can find our full schedule along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Draper, GetLit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Welcome, everyone. We're excited to present authors Jennifer Case, Martha Park, Christina Rivera, Chelsea Steinauer Scudder, and Jessica E. Johnson in this event, Mothering the Future, New Nonfiction on Parenting and Environmental Change. In an age of increasing environmental challenges and social unrest, the need for conversation arises. How do we parent our children in a world of change and disruption? We will hear how each writer approaches these topics from different angles and cultural contexts as they dissect, interrogate, and meditate on what it means to be a mother in an era of environmental change. Before we get to the conversation, we'll start with readings from today's authors. Our first reader is Jennifer Case. Jennifer is the writer of We Are Animals, on the nature of and politics of motherhood, and Sawbill, A Search for Place. Her essays have appeared in journals such as The Rumpus, Orion, Ecotone, Literary Mama, Prairie Schooner, Michigan Quarterly Review, and North American Review. Her scholarship can be found in the Journal of Creative Writing Studies and Essay. She teaches at the University of Central Arkansas and serves as an assistant nonfiction editor at terrain.org. Please welcome Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having us, Kate and Mackenzie. It's such a joy to be part of the Get Lit Festival and part of this panel in particular. So I'm just going to read the prologue to We Are Animals, my collection of essays, and the title is called Message for the Animal Mother. You are teats tingling, hairy line from your pubis to your belly button, stretched skin that has spread and then shrunk to create ripples and dapples. You are bite and aching neck and an arm that always reaches out and will hold a child when they need to be held and will grab that child when they need to be held back. When children hit their heads on a rock or a table or the thinly carpeted floor, you will run to them and hold ice to the pulsing bruise, and in the backside of your left cheek, a bulge of your own will burgeon. You are power, though you do not always know it. You are sparks and mirror neurons and a life force throbbing to reach the future. But sometimes you forget this. Sometimes you lie in bed or wish you were lying in bed, or wander through the rooms of a dark house, a dark cave. Sometimes you push your fingers deep into rocky clay soil, so deep you cut your finger on stone, and still the barb at the back of your chest is a barb, and still your mind is full of voices that conflict. Something pulls you elsewhere, and something holds you here, and you do not know which is the better choice, and so you stay. Mothers have lost themselves in this space. Hands on children, hands in the sink, hands in water turning red and then clear and then frothy. Mothers have brushed their children's hair and seen their own selves spiraling upward like the strands of a spider web, filaments floating and breaking in a breeze. A snail crawls across red bricks on the sidewalk, grit on grit. A blue egg cracks in the gutter. Where are you now? Once you were young and like all of us, naive, and this is how it always is, so don't beat yourself up. Once you thought motherhood wouldn't be bristle, the sharp knob on the back of your neck, the sharp throb of a nerve 2 inches right of your left armpit. Once you thought motherhood meant familyhood or something like that, forgetting that it was you who was the mother, you alone, mouth open and then clenched on a dark and throbbing night. Do not believe this is anyone else's story. Do not believe this is anyone else's choice. When you stare into the lake or the river or wipe the mist from the smoky mirror, you will only see yourself. Oh, mother, you don't believe me. I see you caving in like a carcass, so full of fear you've already made yourself dead. I see you eyeing the white cloth, the small sock, the twisted clasp of the bra. You don't believe me that the anger in you is part of being a mother. You don't believe you will remain a mother just the same. You don't believe that the eye flash, hiccup, aching longing to be elsewhere is one and the same with the hug so tight you feel your child's bones. Oh, mother, the time will come when the belly will glisten and the sky will open and the mud will seep to your ankles. The time will come when the den is empty and the nearly grown daughter will stand at your side. The time will come when the leaves crackle a message and you will let go of the things you need to let go of, and your body will lighten so much you will fly. But until then, lean close and listen. Hear the fervent scratch in my voice. In the deep folds of your pelvis, in the center of that hardened fist, you have always known the answer. You have always made the choices you needed to make. You are not stupid. And when the next choice comes, you will gather yourself, milk, bones, and bristle, and you will go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Our second reader is Martha Park. Martha is a writer and illustrator from Memphis, Tennessee. Martha's writing, graphic essays, and illustrations have appeared in Orion, Oxford American, The Guardian, Guernica, The Bitter Southerner, Granta, Ecotone, ProPublica, and elsewhere. Her first book, World Without End, Essays on Apocalypse and After, is forthcoming from Hub City Press in May. She has received fellowships from the Religion and Environment Story Project, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. Please welcome Martha.
It's really good to be with y'all. My book involves motherhood, but for this short reading, I'm going to read a little bit about some conversations that followed after the first time I visited my husband's childhood home in Kentucky and went to his family's evangelical church for the first time. And I'm trying to wrap my head around how he conceives or growing up conceived of apocalypse. A few years ago, I started noticing bumper stickers on passing cars reading "Not of this world," or simply the letters NOTW drawn as a single swirling graphic, the T looming over the other letters like a distended cross. The phrase is a truncated reference to John 17 when Jesus says, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world." Later, he reiterates, "My kingdom is not of this world." My parents referenced this verse often when I was growing up, but I was surprised to see its widespread use, those 4 letters a shorthand for something I didn't quite understand. For my parents, this verse was a reminder not to be materialistic, not to hoard possessions, or participate in mindless consumerism. But I felt certain this was not the meaning people intended to signify with this abbreviation. When I asked my husband, I learned that he was taught this verse meant that Christ's followers should always be prepared to leave this world behind for God's better world beyond. They were not of this world. They belonged somewhere else and would be going there soon. These 2 interpretations of this single phrase could not be more different. One seems so dualistic, not this world, but that one, while the other emphasizes how to live life here in this world, the only world we know we have. And while it's difficult for me to imagine an unseen world beyond this one, it's impossible to imagine longing for another world. I've asked my husband many times to explain how anticipating the apocalypse works in everyday life. Even if I believed in a world-ending apocalypse, I told him, I couldn't imagine being excited about it. Weren't evangelicals even secretly a little scared? The thing is, Colin said, what's promised at the end of the world is supposed to be so much better than this world. We talked as we drove down a tree-lined street, light streaming through the green leaves. I couldn't imagine anything better than this world. When I told him so, he sighed. He's my evangelical whisperer. There will be no debt, he elaborated, no financial stress, no mental or physical illness. All your loved ones will be reunited. I thought about the way I felt many mornings when I woke to news of hurricanes or wildfires, families rebuilding their homes again and again or forced finally to flee. When I read that an elderly couple in Memphis had frozen to death during a power outage after a freak winter storm, or watched a video of kangaroos bounding across a burning hillside, or saw photos of a farmer's failed crops grown in saline soil, I felt something like a weight, dark and heavy, settling over my chest and an anxious urge to fling it away. Perhaps that feeling was not so different from longing for some other world, for some escape, for a life that didn't feel so uncertain and fraught. Months after visiting my in-laws in Kentucky, I found myself watching recorded worship services on their church website. Several sermons about Noah and the flood drew to a close with a discussion of the end of the world. In one, the pastor began, "What's unique about the Christian faith is that Christianity is the only faith system that identifies the problem with the world as something squarely within us. We're the problem. And the solution is something wholly outside of us. God's gonna judge the world again," my in-law's pastor intoned on my laptop screen, one pixelated hand in the air. This time not by flood, but by fire. He almost looked sorry when he said there was nothing we could do to save ourselves.
Thank you, Martha. Our third author is Cristina Rivera. Cristina is the winner of a Pushcart Prize, whose essays have appeared in The Cut, Orion, Terrain.org, and the Kenyon Review, among other places. She recently won the John Burroughs Nature Essay Award, the highest annual honor for a creative nonfiction essay on place, science, and the environment. Her debut book of essays, My Oceans, is a collection of ecofeminist reflections from the confluence of motherhood and marine life. It was selected as a finalist for the Siskiyou Prize for New Environmental Literature and longlisted for the 2022 Grey Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize. My Oceans was recently published by Northwestern University Press. Please welcome Cristina.
Hi, everyone. It was so beautiful listening to those pieces and so easy to drop in with you all. It's fun. I picked a piece. This is my book, My Oceans. I'm going to read from the very first essay, which is called Blood Moon. And I picked this piece, I think, because one of the major themes that I want to talk about today with you all is just, for me, motherhood really thinned the border of myself, between myself and the environment. And so I'm curious how that manifests for you all, but I think that really manifests in this piece in particular. And in this piece, I'm braiding the birth story of a leatherback turtle with my own birth story. And one fun fact actually is that so my daughter was pulled into labor on a blood moon during an eclipse, which is another example of the environmental effect on our bodies. But this blood moon kind of happens every 2.5 years, and it's happening tonight. So I was like, that's wild when I realized that. Okay. On the eve of a blood moon, my water breaks. In a dimmed room, between pummeling contractions, I crawl on a padded mat under a picture window. I don't make a sound, other than low rumbling outbreaths. I don't open my eyes for the doctor or my husband, but I find the full moon, framed between slow blinks, arcing across black sky. My cervix dilates from 2 to 10 centimeters as the sun, earth, and moon travel independently for 4 hours and 44 minutes to align in total lunar eclipse. The pregnant leatherback turtle has, for over 150 million years, trusted her net to an earth womb. But what she doesn't know is that today, Guatemala's black sand beaches have warmed to new temperatures, lethal temperatures. A birthing sea turtle is in such a state of trance that she does not notice the humans behind her. She drops her eggs, covers them, and scoots back into the ocean without looking back. As volunteers, it was our work to unearth her eggs and rebury them in cooler sand behind protective wire. The hatchling's instinct was sharp. When she broke ground in the nursery, the air was cool. By headlamp, I penciled in measurements, hugged the bucket with 2 arms as I walked it to the high tide line. There, I lowered the lip of the bucket. As the hatchlings began their frenzied race, I strolled to the water, turned around, and laid down the beam of my flashlight. If it mimicked moon or horizon light, I wasn't sure, but the hatchlings paddled toward it. If the leatherback hatchling escapes the clutches of lizards and seagulls and trawl nets and plastic debris and coastal chemical runoff, she might swim into a phase of life that scientists call her lost years. And if in those 10 to 15 years she evades sharks and engine blades and abandoned ghost nets and oil spills and plastic bag jellyfish and the men who pull turtles from the sea to slash their white abdomens for meat, then she will be 1 in 10,000 that survives to adulthood. And if she finds a suitable mate from the males left, another 1 in 1 to 10,000. And if she decides not to shake him off as he nibbles her neck, if she lets him crawl onto her back, and if her eggs ripen, then she may make the pilgrimage back home, which may take time. Leatherbacks travel as far as 10,000 miles a year. But she is faithful, faithful to a cycle unbroken for millions of years. In faith, she swims home. Male sea turtles paddle once into the sea and never return. But a female, by some unresolved scientific mystery, maps the land and her mother's phantom path, that she may find her way back. Under the full red moon, my daughter is born. I hold her in my arms, the beginning of this story. 10 toes and 10 fingers, yes, but also 6 million possible futures nestled into her ovaries. Futures her body cradled before her own fingerprints formed. With my daughter in my arms, I see reflected in her eyes the journey of my pregnancy, labor, and birth. I look deeper and see my mother's journey and my mother's mother's journey, and like this, the planet lights up in moon-pulled tides and blood-pulling moons. I can't reckon a beginning. I wonder who held the beam of light. With my baby's body nestled in my arm, sunrise comes. Someone draws the curtains of the window back, but I still see the moon framed, burned in memory, a lingering shadow of the hours I was guided only by instinct and a single light in a dark sky. I named my daughter Riva for one of its Spanish translations, From the Shore. The leatherback swam on a planet shared with Triceratops and Spinosaurus. Today, the tracks of birthing leatherbacks on Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian coastlines are scant. The headline I pull up says leatherback turtles may become extinct in 20 years. This conclusion from 12 years ago. Maybe she is out there, my leatherback ghost, bobbing and surf, paled by moonlight, waiting for instinct to tug her forth. Maybe she is waiting for the wave that will carry her closest to the only land she's ever known, to the shadow of her mother's path that she has remembered and retraced. Maybe her hooded eye is looking. But on the beach, there are new lights, resort lights and street lights, restaurant lights and house lights and lighthouse lights and bouncing cigarette lights. So many lights she cannot discern the moon, and her belly, maybe it aches with contractions that whisper of urgency, of trance, if only she could reach land and close her eyes.
Thanks so much, Christina. Our fourth reader is Chelsea Steinauer Scudder. Chelsea is the author of Mother, Creature, Kin. She grew up in the Great Plains of Nebraska and Oklahoma. After receiving her Master's of Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, her writing became focused on the confluence of relationship to place and religious and spiritual experience. She previously worked as a staff writer and editor for Emergence Magazine, an online and print publication exploring the intersection of culture, ecology, and spirituality. Her work has also been featured in The Common, The Slowdown, Chronogue Magazine, EcoTheo Review, From the Ground Up, the edited poetry collection Writing the Land, and in Katie Holton's The Language of Trees, a rewilding of literature and landscape. Please welcome Chelsea.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you all. I've been really looking forward to this, and I'm really glad to know we're on the cusp of a blood moon. That feels very special. I'm going to read from chapter 6 of my book. The chapter is called Ascendance, and it's part of sort of a broader meditation about belonging and how becoming a mother made this feeling I had to belong in a place all the more urgent. One April, a portion of eastern Tennessee's population of golden-winged warblers vanished. This was a different vanishing from the one the species continues to endure in the Appalachians, where its population is 5% of historic levels. Different from the fact that this silver migrant songbird who wears a prim yellow hat and sings a buzzy song, has experienced one of the steepest declines of any North American songbird over the last half-century. Different, I mean, from erasure. No, this April disappearance was an intentional vanishing act. The day after the warblers left, a massive storm system barreled through the central and southern United States, generating 84 confirmed tornadoes and leading to 35 human deaths. As the storm passed, the warblers returned, having flown almost 1,000 miles to avoid the weather. The team of researchers tracking them concluded that the birds had heard the infrared waves, acoustic waves inaudible to human ears, produced by the approaching storm when it was as many as 560 miles away. And even though they had completed their seasonal migration and established their breeding territories, they undertook what the scientists called an evacuation migration, and then returned home when it was safe to do so. In myth, the presence and behavior of birds often indicates a moment of potent transition. They come to impart knowledge, or to warn, or to help. This is a common motif across cultures and religious traditions. Winged beings are taken to be closer to God. As such, birds have often been considered thin place creatures, able to move through the veil that separates our plane from the spirit plane, life and afterlife, or world and underworld, or earth and heaven, or human and divine. The dove descends to Jesus at the Jordan River. In varying ways and tellings, raven brings light to the worlds of indigenous peoples in the Eastern Arctic. In the Rig Veda, dark the descent, the birds are golden colored, up to the heaven they fly, robed in the waters. These words could easily describe the Tennessee golden-winged warblers as roiling storm clouds approached. Pigeons were associated with the Sumerian mother goddess Ishtar. In the tomb of Tuna el-Gebel in Egypt, which was likely inaugurated in the 7th century BCE, more than 4 million mummified birds were discovered, most of which were the African sacred ibis. A person of ancient Egypt seeking perhaps a cure for illness or a longer life could have purchased a mummified ibis and offered it in sacrifice. In a 3rd century fresco in the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome, a phoenix sits in its nest engulfed in blood-red flames, a symbol of resurrection. It's the wings. Flight bestows upon birds the means of this boundary crossing, a dual ability to dwell in the sky and on earth, 2 realms woven into one creature. I wonder if humans have been so drawn to birds in so many of our myths and stories because this is what we too long to be, grounded and soaring, animal and divine. And do we not have the capacity to be such beings, at once rooted and connected to something greater than ourselves? I think what is at stake in this capacity, in reaching this rooted and interconnected potential, is an ecological and spiritual sense of belonging, in which we are at once emplaced and in deep relationship to that place. Perhaps better phrased, an eco-spiritual belonging, for the two are not separate. I do not then mean the sort of belonging in which this computer I'm speaking on belongs to me, or this house, or this land. That sort of belonging is limited, one-sided, hierarchical, and turned easily toward destructive and diminishing ends. The question, what belongs to me, is a dead end. But the inverse one, to what do I belong, brings us both to the core of our humanity and into the relationships that sustain and nurture that humanity. As a mother, I am circling this question of belonging, for I have brought a child into a precarious world. The storm clouds are on the horizon, and I must nonetheless teach her how to hold that thread of connection to the sacred and to the earth, even if storms roil her home. This means doing that work myself, for I cannot yet say that I truly deeply belong anywhere. I am apprenticing to the birds. I'm tracking an intuition in wide arcs across the sky, that mothering our children, as well as extending nurture and care to the earth, requires finding our footing first within an eco-spiritual center. This sort of relational belonging requires both the physical spaces and places and the relationships that emerge from those places. Such relationships come to serve as points of connection or sources of mystery or invitations into deeper knowing. At these relational thresholds, the points at which we meet what is beyond ourselves, we might become warm-blooded, feathered bodies taking flight. Some might name that belonging God, others might name it forest. These do not need to be the same thing, nor are they mutually exclusive. Did not the Tennessee golden-winged warblers display such belonging as creatures hopping among the branches of their native trees while tuning into the approaching storm, which was far from visible but nonetheless viscerally sensed? Upon observing the behavior of the warblers, the researchers began asking, and this became the central question of their subsequent paper, whether paying attention to birds could serve as an accurate advance warning of disaster. My central question was, how can I be more like a warbler?
Thank you, Chelsea. Our final reader is Jessica E. Johnson. Jessica is a writer, educator, and arts organizer. She is the author of the memoir Metalwork, the book-length poem Metabolics, and the chapbook In Absolutes We Seek Each Other. Her work has appeared in The Common, The Paris Review, The New Republic, Tin House, and River Teeth, among others. Her honors include an Oregon Literary Fellowship and a Best American Essays Notable. A longtime community college instructor, she lives in Portland, Oregon, and co-hosts the Constellation Reading Series. Please welcome Jessica.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. I'm happy to be in your company. I'm reading from Metalwork, and this book is an examination of the ways in which becoming a mother helped me prompted me to re-examine the ways in which I was born into all sorts of disconnection growing up in mining camps. And a lot of that examination is through letters that my mother wrote during that time. But I'm going to read a piece from the end where I turn toward writing a letter to my daughter, who is elementary age at that time, like early elementary. The cedars are still today, and the big leaf maples haven't leafed. I can see straight through them to the blue, distant hill. I used to feel this wanting feeling when I'd see the shape and color of relative distance. When I lived in Seattle, it was the afternoon sun flashing off mirrored towers across the lake. When I was in Italy, it was a massive church dome in the distance. And in St. John's, it was the blue hill of Forest Park across the Willamette. It was as if I could only locate myself if I was far from a fixed point. From long training, I did not know how to imagine that I too was in a place that mattered. I too was a place that mattered. In an hour or so, you'll be home from school. I'll wait in the yard and the bus will stop, and you'll sulk down the steps, dragging your backpack, books, and paper in your hand, your coat hanging off your shoulders. I'll ask you how the day was, and you'll say, thumb sideways, meaning you're ambivalent, or terrible, which is usually because one bad thing ruined the rest. I'll bring you inside and try to talk you into a bath while you unspool a story of who said what to whom. You will scowl at each injustice as you tell the story. Good. It's possible to see now, as an image on a screen, the shape of underground ore bodies without ever breaking the surface, the formations of minerals and metals tightly layered and laced by the long story of the earth. I am learning to recognize presences rather than endless departures, what is rather than what is never enough. I am learning to see the kind of home that makes itself around us, depending on to whom we are present, to whom we pay attention, to whom we are honest, to whom we are accountable, to whom we respond. I'm trying to learn what it means to be more present and more honest, less smoothed over. Since I started wandering in the dimension that would become this book, I haven't been much of a homemaker. My cabinets are a mess, rooms remain unfinished. The house is a long to-do list that I often ignore, especially as I've turned again and again toward this story of our family and toward my students and toward problems we can't pretend to shut the door against. I have failed where my mother excelled, in this elevated domestic sphere that was her means of creativity, her measure of control. If I could pass one thing down to you that I did not myself inherit, it would be things I am still learning. People keeping instead of housekeeping, and a more expansive version of whom you might consider kin, whose concerns you understand as linked to yours. I have written about the experience of growing, birthing, and raising people as an absence from oneself. I have written about mining as the making of an absence, above ground as below, the absence of context and a failure of story. I have written about the early shape of absence following me into the present, as if the early absences of my childhood were inside me. I have sung this sense of gone. I have rhymed it with bone, the deepest sense of structure. I'm learning how to meet myself again. I'm learning how to write differently than I was trained to, learning to fill some of gone in my bones with context. I'm learning what it means to write more honestly. Today, after your bath, I'll dry you and brush your hair and dress you in warm clothes. I'll lay back on the couch, and if I'm lucky, you will find me. And I'll quiet what's restless in myself. And if you want, I'll tell you how close we are to rivers and mountains, tell you where the water comes from and where it goes. For as long as you need me to, I'll be your ground, holding you here and here and here.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Now that we've heard a bit from each of you, let's turn things back over to the panel for a conversation about parenting, identity, intersectionality, and ecology.
Well, first of all, it's been such a delight to listen to everyone read their excerpts. I very much feel I'm amongst kin and like-minded individuals, and I could find lines I could relate to in everyone's pieces. So it's really a pleasure to sit here on Zoom today and look at your faces and be able to have this conversation.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It is, I mean, writing a book is so lonely and no one's there bouncing things off of you. And this is one of my first panels, and listening to these excerpts and seeing how they're all talking to each other just feels, it's really invigorating. So, and it's very less lonely.
It is. I was noticing similar words coming up in all of our pieces, and the concept of kin and faith, right? And connection and interconnection and what it means to be a mother. And yeah, such wonderful connections. I'm really looking forward to delving into them in the next hour or so. So I guess first of all, my question is, we're all writing into the future, right? And about the future as parents and thinking about the future as parents and environmental writers. So to start us off, I was wondering if everyone could just tell us a little bit about your goals, right? When you sat down to write these books, what were your goals and how did you hope your book might influence environmental conversations or conversations about motherhood, or kind of the confluence of those two subjects?
First every time, right? Great. I think with this book, as with a lot of things, I didn't know what I was looking for until I was mostly done and saw where it had taken me. And I think for me, a lot of the big questions I was asking about the future of the earth as we thought about having kids really braided themselves with kind of how do we think of ourselves like cosmologically, and if my son and now my daughter are inheriting a physical environment for me and my family, they're also inheriting some of our spiritual backgrounds. And I wrote this book as my dad was retiring from the ministry, and I didn't know what a loop that was going to throw me into. I thought, oh God, I've got to figure out how I feel about a lot of stuff right now. And so I think I started writing the book as a way to figure out how I felt about all of those things. And I think one of the things I keep noticing as I'm just beginning to talk to people about my book is that there's like this kind of need for people to confess like where they stand about religion when they're talking to me. And like I have no idea where I stand. And I guess as I've started having those conversations, I've realized one of the things I'm actually hoping to impart is that like we can learn about our cosmology or our spirituality or our religion from the world, and that religion came from the world. I feel like there's this perception that it kind of dropped out of the sky directly from an angel or something. And I just find myself really thinking a lot that like the world never really arrives anywhere and we don't have to arrive anywhere. And that I think that that's actually living a lot closer to the world rather than being in conflict with it. I think that's something I'm interested in as like raising a kid in the South, and with the kind of religion that's dominant here, is it's a kind of faith that feels very at odds with anything you would learn from just being a person in the world. And so I think those are the things that have kind of emerged over time for me.
Thanks, Martha. Like, as you said, you're pulling out and seeing the same thing is happening for me when I was in the work. I think I had different goals. And now that I'm out of the work, I'm like, oh, how is this hitting people? And the book, it only is published, is officially out in the world tomorrow, but people, there are early readers. And so I'm just starting to get back their feedback. And I have this, a lot of people are telling me they're crying a lot. So I feel like, and I have this pencil, this is definitely not crying. And I think it's a symbolic and also like a sign, because actually I missed, there's a typo on this one. So I had to order some new ones, and they and the company that sent them to me, I ordered them like in December, and it's been 3 months, and they're in LA, so I didn't want to pester them at all, but they finally showed up, and there's 460 pencils, and I only ordered like 70. So I just think it's funny and symbolic that I feel like tears is really coming out as a theme, and it's symbolic for the fact that I think one of the words that I really want to introduce, or I hope maybe it's already in the lexicon, but just embodied climate science. Like I said earlier, I think that there's this thinning between my body and the environment that really happened through the shattering process of motherhood. And my background is in experiential education, and so what I used to do is take these student groups into very remote parts of the world, and we would get very vulnerable, and we do lots of briefing, and I learned very early on that when I was doing these briefing and debriefing sessions, if I shed a single tear, it just opened up the floodgates, and everyone was able to express themselves on a whole nother level. And so I think I definitely have cried into every page of this book, and I'm hoping, and I feel very vulnerable putting it out. It's definitely heavy on the memoir, and I'm hoping by putting out my vulnerability and my tears, that it opens up some floodgates for other people to feel those things. I think I repressed a lot of my eco grief for a long time, and it was giving me nightmares and anxiety, and I really wrote into this book to work through that. And of course it's not gone, and I've just merged into it, and now I'm very friendly with my eco grief and my tears. But yeah, embodied climate science is something that I would love to see more of in the world. And I'm already, and it's cool because I'm seeing it and I'm hearing it in all of your excerpts already. So it's exciting. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Christina and Martha and Jenny for that question. I also cried a ton writing this book. Like, I cried so much. And I also really shifted my goals. I think from the beginning, I probably didn't even know what it meant really to have a goal in a book. This is my first book, and it was a really big learning curve. I think, but now looking, I think one of my goals when I set out was I'm going to like answer all these questions. And of course, I probably answered 0 questions and ended up with a lot more questions, but in a really sort of opening way. And I think, yeah, I think I could say one of my goals now is to sort of one of the through lines for me writing the book and now going back and sort of reading it again after some time away from it is really thinking about frameworks of care and what it means to sort of widen that circle of care as mothers who are doing that care for our children and our families and our communities, but also thinking about what does it mean to sort of inhabit that, embody, I love that word, Christina, embody that that care and that attention and nurturing as we're also relating to the earth and thinking about mothering as a way of yeah, framing that care even for people who aren't mothers of human children, however they would like to define that, thinking about what does it mean to have unconditional care for the earth, and how can each of us, yeah, I really fully believe all of us as human beings are capable of sort of extending that care. And so, yeah, I think one of my hoped for goals of the book is to just talk to people about that and ask that question, what does that mean? I'm still working out what that means for me, and I'm just so curious to know sort of what that means for other people too. Yeah.
So interesting, everyone's answers. I certainly did not have goals that I had words for at the beginning. Coming mainly from poetry, my goal was to like write many words, more than I had been writing before. And I think if I could put words to where I was when I was in the process, I think my goal was really to look at matrilineal inheritances and look at the heteronormative nuclear family in the context of my own life. And that became an environmental story because it had to, in a couple of different ways. One, like what it is my parents were doing on the land, of course, could not be like, I could not write the book and ignore that. Two, I'm teaching environmental lit this whole time. So those ideas are with me. And three, looking around at what is happening, you know, ash is falling from the sky. There's, it's really the manifestations of climate chaos are becoming present as it's happening. So I think that is how it happened. And the book is layered in ways that I didn't always have full control over.
Yeah, I can relate to all of that, where I started writing We Are Animals with a lot of questions, which just created more questions, right? And I kept writing into those questions. And I'm not sure I answer any of them in the book, though I still come to more understanding. And for me, I was especially motivated by the tensions I was experiencing in my life between my experience of motherhood and then conceptualizations of mainstream feminism and evolutionary biology, right, in ways that my body just couldn't quite be in the world the way I thought it was supposed to be. And so a better understanding how we are as embodied individuals and how our understanding of evolutionary biology can help us, you know, navigate those places where modern life just really isn't built for mothering or for the mothering body. And in particular, my second pregnancy was unintended, and in 2016 as reproductive rights were being taken away. So I'm also asking that question, right? How do we approach reproductive rights, and how does evolutionary biology and embodied experiences of motherhood help us avoid some of those partisan divides and complicate those conversations? So I guess my goal is it will at least lead to conversation and help complicate those conversations. Which does lead me to the next question, which was, how has motherhood impacted the way you relate to the non-human world? And what does it mean to be a mother in an era of environmental change? And as I was listening to all your answers to the first question, that conversation of tears kept coming up, right, Christina? And I know for myself, my background was in environmental writing. So, you know, I considered myself a place-based writer even before I started writing about motherhood. But becoming a mother really ratcheted up my climate anxiety and eco grief to a point I wasn't prepared for. So there's definitely essays in here that I was using to try and process that, right? Because yeah, environmental destruction, it feels so much more painful and personal when you know you have a child who will live into a future, hopefully, right? Even if you yourself may not. So yeah, how has motherhood impacted the way you relate to the environment or the non-human world? Because I know you all have been engaged in these conversations for a long time.
The first thing I thought about this was how motherhood has this amazing ability to make your lens like very zoomed in and very zoomed out at the same time. And I'm finding myself noticing stuff in such a different way. I was on a walk with a friend in the park the other day and noticed that like this giant island of gumballs had formed after a rainstorm, just like thousands of them in this one part of the park. And I interrupted this conversation. I was like, "Oh my God, I have to bring James here. This is so cool." And she was just like, what are you talking about? And I feel like I'm kind of living in this place all the time where I'm like very excited about a worm, but also like very terrified a lot of times about the world my son is and my daughter. She's very new, so I keep talking about my son because he's the one I'm talking about in this book, but Junie is here now too. The world that they're inheriting. And I think for me, because so much of my concern is like is religious, is I'm finding myself a lot of the time really on guard about the religious stories my son's inheriting about the environment. And there's this story, there's a little children's book version of Jonah and the Whale at his pediatrician's office that he's always trying to read. And I think it's like the worst possible interpretation of this story. And I'm fine. He always wants to read it, and I'm like editing it as we're reading and like taking stuff out. And I think he can tell like this is not what this book says. And I'm just always working really hard against narratives that like natural disasters are like God punishing us or speaking to us, because if anything, those things are just us talking to ourselves. And I think that's something that I've found really ratcheted up since I had kids. And I guess I think something I keep finding myself drawn toward since having children is just this feeling that like if caring for the environment, advocating for the environment, being involved in a religious community or having kids isn't widening your circle of care or your community, then it's doing the wrong thing. And that's like ultimately kind of where all those things are pushing a person. And I guess I'm finding like some clarity in that for myself. I'm like kind of like a Uber Libra and never land anywhere or decide anything. And so I feel like writing about these three things and how they're kind of entangled has allowed me to find a bit of solid ground to stand on, where it's like that has become kind of a discernment for me, where if something feels like it's moving in that direction, I automatically can trust it a little more than if it feels like it's withdrawing into individualism or an impulse toward like survivalism or like maintaining my own resources or whatever. That's kind of where I'm finding myself lately.
Like you, Martha, I think shifting POV, shifting point of view has been a major outcome of becoming a mother for me. My pregnancies were traumatic. I had 4 of them. And so as anyone who's suffered through trauma can probably relate, like trauma just shatters time. And actually it's funny because that the story of those 4 pregnancies, it's called 4 Circles, and it's in the middle of the book. And for a long time I was like, why do I keep putting it in the middle of the book? And then I just finally realized that all the other pieces are orbiting around it. It's just not it's not a linear story. Like the birth of my children was the center. And in that essay, I break time completely, and because that's how I experienced it, and that was what was true to my experience. But the other thing I wanted to bring about motherhood impacting how you relate to the non-human world is just that, like, I mean, there's so many examples, but breastfeeding was just so wild to me, like that no one told me and no one taught me. And that like I had this child and this novel function of my body just dropped down. I'm like still just absolutely bewildered by it. And I'm not shaming anyone who like who doesn't choose to breastfeed, because I think there's other comparable experiences that drop you into like our wild animalness, but that one for me was pretty earthquaking. And when I comprehended that whales also have like lactate and make milk that drops down in their bodies and feeds their infants, I mean, that was one of the connecting threads. I mean, there's so many, but I think it was a major connecting thread. And once I started seeing that thread and I started feeling into all these other threads, that was a lot of where I centered my writing and work, is to examining those threads of interconnection.
Yeah, I also had a similar experience of recognizing my own animalness in a way I had never done before. And it helped me in a way sort of get over I always had this, as a writer, just this sort of paranoia about anthropomorphizing and projecting things onto non-human creatures. And I think the book just really helped me get over that fear and accept that I was going to always be using a limited language and getting it wrong. And but that sort of finding those connections like that. I had a similar experience of, oh my gosh, breastfeeding, and also this whale is breastfeeding, and realizing that that's not so much a projection, but a way of sort of building a bridge of empathy and understanding and finding the sort of common, sort of a literal common ancestor, however many millions of years back. And I think the other big shift I had was that I think before becoming a mother, I really thought I had fully engaged the climate crisis emotionally and spiritually. And I think similar, I think there are all kinds of ways that people can drop into that more fully. And for me, motherhood was, just sort of opened up this chasm of kind of just like an exquisitely painful vulnerability that I had never experienced before. And, it's like suddenly your heart is this mortal, living, breathing child who's running around and you feel terrified all the time. And I think one of the things that most surprised me in the book was just that vulnerability really just spilled over into all these non-human worlds I was exploring. And so learning about these endangered whales, or witnessing the death of this brood of barn owl chicks. And I just really had this experience of like being brokenhearted over and over and over, but in a way that also was like a deepening love that I had just never gone that deep before, I think. And so, I feel like, motherhood has allowed me to deepen, to just sort of be in that vulnerable space. I think before I could escape it, but as a mother, I can't escape that vulnerability. And so it's just there all the time, mediating my relationship to the world.
Echoing vulnerability. That's a really good way of phrasing it. I think that is what happened to me also. And in the process of writing the book, I certainly I didn't have the animal awakening with breastfeeding. I had wanting to flee from that feeling. So it did not come to me till later. I did not have that. If I'd had your books, maybe I would have had that then. But in the subsequent examination, and looking again, it was a looking back on inheritances thing for me. Like Jenny was talking about mainstream feminism, like the failures of mainstream feminism. And I definitely felt within this vulnerability of motherhood, the need to have resources, wisdoms, things that I did not have. And I think what has happened for me is, yes, grief, yes, anxiety, but also a deep love and leaning on the earth, sometimes physically, because I need it, and I feel more intensely with it, and I feel like it is what I have, and like I will go lie down on it. So I feel like a really intense and material connection that I strive to, hold up my end of that also. But I think that's the biggest change for me, is feeling within that vulnerability a really intense need and an intense love, and almost to some extent like a meeting in brokenness also.
Yeah, I think before I became a mother, when I look back, I can definitely recall, me as an environmental writer, primarily engaging concepts in the world through my head through a very cerebral lens, right? And motherhood forced me to stop doing that, and maybe for the first time to really experience myself as an animal, right? And an animal self. And then, you know, what happens? And suddenly the chasm or the dichotomy between myself as a human, right, and then the non-human world, it just started to blur and fall apart and not be as meaningful in terms of differences anymore. So I definitely got a fuller sense of interconnection in a way that's hard to describe, but, you know, is vulnerable and yet also freeing at the same time. Yeah. So what has bolstered you? We've been talking about vulnerability and tears. So what has bolstered you as you're doing this work as a mother or a mother exploring environmental change in your writing? What do you lean on?
I think some of the longer essays in my book are ones that are about people that are involved in conservation around the South. And I think for me, just spending time with people who this is their life's work and remembering that like the work isn't done and the end hasn't happened yet, and that the work is ongoing is the most bolstering thing. I think I talked to some people in Florida who are involved in sometimes kind of obsessively trying to save this very rare tree. It's one of my favorite stories I've ever been involved in writing. And there was so much disagreement between all of them and so much, I don't know, it was a lively and kind of contentious group of people that all had different ideas about how this tree could be saved. And some of it was working within science, and some people believed we need to be manually moving the tree north. And it was so fun to remember that a lot of this hasn't been decided what the methods are going to be, but to see people being willing to try it, willing to argue about it, willing to risk being wrong if it meant that their favorite tree stayed alive, like just help me remember that this is like it's a living world. And I think one of my favorite things someone told me was a forester in Arkansas, for a different story I wrote about the ivory-billed woodpecker. He was talking about how kind of the announcement that the ivory bill had been found in the woods there had changed their forestry practices, and that he kind of said, you know, there could have been some embarrassment that we haven't ever found proof that it's actually here, but we just decided to act as if it could be here. And what would we do if it was here? And that always just kind of gives me chills. Like what if we just acted as if we could change the direction of things? What if we acted as if we could save this tree we love? I find it's kind of hard for me to feel despairing when I'm talking to people who are doing this work more directly and not just kind of like me writing about it in my room. And I just feel like more connection with people doing that kind of work is a huge balm for me.
Yeah. I like how you avoided the word hope, because I think we all have experience with the word hope. And I love the word bolster because it's not something up here, you know, it's underneath and it's uplifting. And yeah, and I work in climate communications too, so sometimes I'm helping companies with their messaging around this, and so I've done like looked at the research, and they say that the number one motivator for taking action to protect the climate is love for the future, and it's 11 times more stronger than jobs or the economy. And like that makes me so happy that I have that in common with so many people, even if it's doesn't always feel like that. I feel like we're definitely, you know, seeing a massive, I mean, this is my opinion, war going on in terms of like a culture of control versus a culture of care. And I feel like I'm really surrounded by the care people. And it's really easy to get down by the culture of control, but I've also been a 16-year-old girl, and that didn't really work for me. So like, I feel hope and like excitement for rebellion too. And yeah, and just that, yeah, like COVID too also just really showed us that hard, you know, in hard times, like communities came together. or at least that was my feeling. And admittedly, I live in this really cool small mountain town in the middle of nowhere, but people really came together. And I think that's been proven through a lot of disasters that people, when they're given the opportunity, they do show resiliency and they do come together and collaborate. So that also bolsters me.
Yeah, I really agree with all of that. Two of my favorite days working on the book were one that I got to go out onto a salt marsh where they were sort of measuring salt marsh erosion, but also trying to figure out how they could just like replenish the sediments. And the person was really nice and like let me do the readings on their instrument, and then being out on the water with the right whales. And yeah, totally, Martha. Just seeing people who, even when sometimes it's the most dismal forecast for this species or this ecosystem, are still out there every single day doing the work. That was so powerful to me. And then I think the other thing that bolsters me is just my daughter, who's 4 right now, and she just still very much lives in this like wild, present tense way where, her world is animate and that's not even a question. And it's like sometimes I just see her and I'm like, oh, I have to wade through, 38 years of like conditioning and ego and separation to even get close to where she can just arrive naturally talking to a tree or something. And just, I think part of why that bolsters me is just that reminder that human beings are just inherently able to just be in this like seamless, easy, natural relationship to the world. Like even now, still in our climate and our culture, children are still coming into the world with that inherent possibility and reality. And even if it's like a long way back to get there for many of us adults, I think just the sense that that is possible and that is like fundamental to who we are as human beings gives me some strength to carry on.
Many things bolster me. Often my students bolster me for similar reasons that you all have talked about. They are young and starting out from really often like socioeconomically disadvantaged circumstances, but they are often going forth really capably and in clear-eyed ways. So that is always really like, I'm like, okay, we got this. The future's here. They're like 21. They're killing it. So that's always really good to see. And also I draw a lot of sustenance from women of color feminisms that come from a more earth connected and generally connected and intersectional place, that have more of the connection, I think, that I wish that I needed when I first became a mom and didn't have.
Yeah, conversations like this definitely bolster me. And my book has been out now for about 6 months. And so it didn't bolster me when I was writing the book, but since the book has come out, it's been such a rewarding experience to hear from readers who felt similar things, right? Who struggled through some of the same kinds of tensions and lonelinesses that I did, that I was writing the book about. And just to hear that, someone's writing can help someone process some of their own experiences, or how we're all experiencing many similar things, thinking we're experiencing them in isolated environments when really we aren't, right? We're having similar emotions and experiences in those situations. That's been very bolstering to be able to build those connections and, know that some of my work is helping others navigate their own lives in the same way other people's writing has helped me navigate my own. So those connections have meant a lot. Yeah. One question I'm always very curious about, though, when talking with other writers who are mothers and writing about motherhood, is what was the hardest part for you about writing about motherhood? So what was the biggest challenge for you working on your books?
I think one of the things I kept coming back to was that I really wanted to write a version of my book that would like come out of somebody else's life. Like I did not have the life to write the kind of book I was envisioning writing, and I kept having to like periodically like know that and accept that and get comfortable writing what I could write with limited time. I wrote a lot of it during 2020 with a newborn and an infant. And some of that was also just like a form question. Like I kind of started writing more personal lyrical stuff in the beginning and then got really into writing reported essays and incorporating other people's stories. And sometimes I would have this temptation to like separate them out and be like, well, the lyrical fragmented stuff needs to go together and then the reported stuff needs to go together. And I think at a certain point I just had to like hold them together and like love that they came from a life that was also kind of fragmented and stop fighting that and stop thinking I had to write separate things for separate forms or like some that, you know, I feel like there's a lot of nonfiction that feels very like streamlined and cohesive in a way that I am just not going to be able to write right now. And I think just like accepting that um, and coming to appreciate the fact that there is a kind of friction there was like a thing I had to learn kind of like over and over and over again. And just felt like I was kind of throwing myself against a wall a lot of the time. There's just a lot of books and there's a lot of pressure, I think, to write a certain kind or several certain kinds of books. And I just think I hope that other people feel the same way, that I want to write books, you know, from people who have had to scramble to get childcare that day or who are making a very quick trip, even though they'd rather make a longer trip or like, I want to read more books like that. And so I think kind of realizing that about myself as I wrote was like kind of the main writing lesson I kind of learned through this process.
Yeah, I got a lot of pressure when I was starting to seek a publisher to rewrite the book as a memoir instead of a collection of essays. But I wrote it as a collection of essays because I didn't have the headspace for a whole memoir while my children were young. So I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, my biggest challenge too is shape and form and the fact that that motherhood, you know, shattered me and the pregnancy trauma shattered me, and it was like taking a mirror and breaking all the pieces, you know, like shattering it on the ground, and like you can't just like put that back. You know, people were like, make it narrative. Like I can't just put this back together. It didn't come out of me that way. And even if I do, you know, it's gonna look different. It's gonna be all wonky and there's going to be infinite possibilities for how to put together fragments. And that's hard because like, yeah, I mean, I call mine a book of essays, but I still feel like it's very fragmented. And there's a lot of experimental essays and there's hermit crab essays because that's just the way it wanted to show up. And I do think books they come talk to you and they have a way they want to show up. And I think, you know, that was the shape that was reflective of the experience. But like many of you experienced, you know, like in publishing, there is like a very traditional narrative that people like and that turns pages. And I was just commenting, someone on Facebook, like a distant aunt was just saying like, oh, I'm so excited to like get lost in this and turn the pages so quickly. And I'm like, I don't know if it's going to be that experience for you. Essays don't do that. Like essays ask you to put the book down and think about it. And essays ask you to explore the white spaces and to engage and not to turn the pages necessarily. So, not only writing it in that shape, but also teaching or guiding readers into like how to read a different form that they're accustomed to. I mean, I know that you all are accustomed to this, but like none of my friends have ever read an essay collection until this week. So guiding them through that process and guiding other people and giving them permission to read it. And because that is also the beauty of a fragmented collection is you don't have to read it from the beginning to the end. You can start in the middle, you can start anywhere. And I think that's really cool if you look at it from that angle. So yeah, shape and form was my challenge.
Resonating with what you have all said so much. I had, just a real challenge of accepting, I'm hesitant to even call it my limits, but my new shape as a mother, and experiences where I was trying to go somewhere to interview someone or be part of something, and I could only go for 36 hours because I was breastfeeding and my daughter wouldn't drink pumped milk and she wouldn't drink or eat anything else while I was gone. So it was super stressful, and in feeling like I was coming up short because of that, and just needing to sort of accept that that's the way it was, and I was going to work with what I could. And I think another challenge I had was just letting go of some of the expectations about what I was writing about when I started writing the book, and sort of where I thought I would end up when I got to the end of the book, and then where I actually ended up. Even just emotionally, I had this big plan when I started writing that I was going to write about hope, and I was going to sort of write my way into being hopeful for the future. And it started to be like, thou dost declare your hope too much, because it really started to just not, I was just going and going and going, and finding that I was actually feeling less and less hopeful, and starting to sort of panic about that. And having to just, where I really came down on was that I did have hope, but it wasn't reliable, and it didn't feel like a foundation I could stand on. And I sort of finally came out of that with this sense of love as being this foundation that was reliable and unflinching and deepening. And that was sort of the place I could stand with this book. But it was a really long journey to even just sort of emotionally accept that I often don't feel very hopeful. And I still feel strange saying that, because it feels like something you're not supposed to say as a human or as a parent. But so I think just sort of the emotional process of writing the book was a big challenge. And and just sort of being okay with ending in what felt like an emotionally complicated and uncomfortable place, when I didn't want or expect for that to be the case.
To respond to Chelsea, as like, so I teach environmental lit online, and I've been doing it for almost 10 years maybe. And so it's really interesting to see, and since I teach at community college, it's like everybody. So like, you could get a basketball coach from a small town in rural Oregon, or you could get like an environmental science major. I mean, it's like everybody. And it's interesting to see how the conversation has gone from something else to like, we're talking about the end of the species now. So like it's just interesting to see what that trajectory is. And I hear you about the hopelessness, and you're not alone in that. I'm trying to remember what was hard. So I've written actually 3 books about motherhood, one of which will never be published, because I don't want it to be. And another 2, and so I wrote a poetry collection while I was writing metalwork also. And it's interesting, a lot of you talked about the fragment, maybe narrative or maybe cohesion, tension. And there's a lot of ways we could define that tension, I think. I wanted to write something continuous, because I knew that as a poet, I could really evade myself with fragmentation if I wanted to. And I really wanted to stick with the topic, even if it was hard. So doing that was really hard, but it also didn't end up in the kind of narrative arc that is palatable in the culture. It ended up in something a lot more layered, I think, and ambiguous. So, but even so, trying to write something cohesive was intensely hard for me. So hard that I had to like blow off steam with the side project, I guess. And the other thing that has been hard for me across all 3 books is a sense of like internalized misogyny about no one will care about this, and moms don't matter that much, because that's what I feel, and I think many of us feel every day in the construction of society, is the devaluation of motherhood, the devaluation of care, and it felt really hard to spend so much time focusing on that in the face of structural inequity.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I felt a lot of those tensions too, Jessica, in writing. And also, my book has a lot to do with maternal mental health, right? And it explores kind of the emotional experience of an unintended pregnancy and prenatal depression, postpartum depression, all of that. And there were so many times when I was trying to write honestly about some of those experiences, and then the reader feedback would be, this is too uncomfortable, or I don't know if you should include this, or, what will your son think later on? And I definitely thought very carefully about what my children might think later on if they were to ever read the essays. But I think it's just so hard to write honestly about these complicated experiences, and maybe especially honestly about motherhood. Sometimes there's a lot of cultural messaging that prevents us from doing so. So for me, kind of bolstering myself enough to be able to move forward and discern what I wanted to include and not include, but how to nonetheless write honestly in a way that would hopefully open space for others was definitely a challenge. We have time for one more question, and I know we're going to have some people in the audience who are emerging writers or writers themselves. So I really want to end with kind of a craft question, which is, what advice would you give to other writers who are also writing about motherhood or family? So writers who are working on maybe projects with some similar themes as all of our own. What advice would you give to those individuals?
I think this is kind of an extension of what we were just talking about in part, but I guess I would just say, not to wait till your circumstances feel more like advantageous to writing, and just write what you can. And I think one thing I wish I'd done more is that there were stories that I wrote where I edited out a lot of the like chaos that was going on. Like I wanted to write kind of just a magazine-y story about going to this event, and I left out the fact that like my husband called as I was on the way and said, I've got COVID, and he's home with like our 9-month-old. And I'm like, we're all getting COVID. And then I went back and got COVID and was sick for a really long time. And I kind of just left all that out, and just stuff like that. And sometimes I just wish I'd opened the door to some of that a little bit more and didn't try to like push it away. And yeah, that whole situation. And then I think the other thing would just be like find writers like writing about stuff, either like similar themes or in a form that really excites you, and just like reach out to them and make friends, because it can just be, I think it can be really crazy making to be writing in isolation. And that it's just, there's like I just think a specific kind of like deep understanding when people are like, I am also writing these weird essays in my house. That has been a huge help to me as I'm trying to find my way.
Nice. I would say I feel like I got told so many times to write a hero's journey, and I read the book and I like wrote, like plotted and tried it, and it never worked. It never fit. And I would say that like the alternate that, and also the climate crisis doesn't need hero's journeys. Like that's a broken model for climate crisis. It doesn't work. So the alternate method is, the gatherer's journey, which I'm totally stealing this from Ursula K. Le Guin, who wrote about this in regards to fiction. But there is a whole nother story of the gatherer who goes out and gets the medicine and the food that will sustain people when the hunter doesn't come back with meat, and that to like go collect the different pieces, which will be often in fragments, and then come home and spread them out and see how they're talking to each other and do something with that, because that's a story about collaboration and community and cooperation, and those are stories that we need in this time.
Yeah, I again completely agree with all of that, so I won't repeat it, but I think one other piece of advice I would give is just, I think when we're writing about motherhood or family or things that are very close to us, it can be worthwhile to just pay attention to what feels, just sort of where your boundaries are in terms of privacy and personal information and where you feel comfortable sharing. And obviously there's a huge spectrum of that. But that you, I think I was resonating what you were saying, Jenny, about how you can, still share deeply and honestly and keep whatever your boundaries are around what you feel comfortable sharing. I think I often felt pressure to sort of share things that I wasn't super comfortable sharing, and it was just good for people to remind me. And so you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. And I just finished reading Lucy Jones's book, Matrescence, and she goes into this like incredibly deep personal detail about herself and her body and her experiences, but we never learned the names of like her children or her husband. And it was just like a refreshing reminder that writing in these very personal spheres, just sort of being mindful of that.
I think what I would say is, when it's all done and your book is a book, the things that have the feedback that has been the most meaningful to me have come from, the other mother writers who I'm in community with. And that'll be different for everybody. That'll be different for other people. But when you're, making craft decisions or like in the seeking publication process or whatever, there are all these decision moments and you can feel pressured to change this or that. But just remember that what's meaningful on the other side is your community and the people around you and your family and your children, and keep it for you and for them.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is to not be afraid to write into difficulty. I think my best essays are always those that fearfully and yet fearlessly, right, are willing to tackle those complexities and those emotional complexities and ask difficult questions knowing they won't quite be able to answer them, but are willing to go on the journey and to surprise myself with the answer, because oftentimes the most difficult essays I've approached have ended in a place I didn't expect them to, and definitely, brought a resolution that was useful to me and hopefully useful to others and has a place in the craft. So yeah, gathering that courage, and honoring your own limits, but also being brave and willing to ask the difficult questions and to really listen to your heart and the questions your heart is asking you to write about. Yeah. This has been really beautiful, everyone. I've so appreciated talking with you all and listening. Is there anything else any of you wanted to say in response or to leave us with? Just content smiles. Well, thank you again, Kate and Mackenzie and Get Lit, for having us here. It's been absolutely delightful.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Jennifer, Martha, Christina, Chelsea, Jessica. That was just such a fantastic discussion. Thanks, Jenny, for leading and asking such great questions. It was really powerful how connected your work was to each other, yet you all shared such unique perspectives and experiences. That's obviously the goal for a lot of our panels, but you all really made this feel extra special. So thank you for discussing these topics with such passion and care. I do think this is going to inspire a lot of people. Last year, actually, we got a lot of survey responses asking for more events centered around motherhood and the climate crisis and eco writing, which are all topics that I'm also very passionate about. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to celebrate you all and highlight this important work. I know this event is going to exceed all of those people's expectations who are hoping for topics like that. And yeah, thank you again for sharing so much of yourselves and giving us such great inspiration for entering into these topics in our own writing. Thank you also to Mackenzie, Get Lit's assistant coordinator, for all of their hard work today and behind the scenes leading up to this event. To everyone watching at home, I hope that you will join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for our full schedule and more information about all of today's authors. Thank you again for joining today. Goodbye, everybody.